Everyone who goes to an art school probably is familiar with this. You work hard, you put your work up on the wall, and then your teacher and your peers tell you how you could have done better. And while it can be a little bit hard to listen to feedback, it develops the skill to be objective about your work and eventually get better and better at producing good work. This is the idea behind these critique series. I try to provide other people with feedback so that you can go take that feedback and do better work as a result of it. So I want to thank everyone who submitted images for this critique. And remember, in the comments, it takes a lot of courage to allow someone to critique your work publicly. So please be respectful of the people who offered their images for critique. Without further ado, let's dive into render critique number 4. All right, here we are with image submission number 1. And the first thing I'd say you nailed right off the bat is we have a focal point. I know exactly where I'm supposed to look at. You brought a lot of contrast into this image, which I think is working in your favor. We've separated the product from the background, so you're good there. Now, when I think about ways to improve this image, the first thing that comes to mind is I just don't know what this is. Like, it's a container, but what kind of container is it? I do see some little details here. It would be interesting to understand if they serve a function, if there's some sort of magnetic feature, or if that's simply just how it's constructed. So I have a lot of questions as to what it is, or perhaps some of your design decisions, because I don't know what this is. Now, if I zoom on out, the other thing I want to address is the background. While I think you've given us a clear focal point, like I said, I think the background isn't necessarily serving you as best as it could. I would take the opportunity in this case to use the background to give context to the rendering. Maybe something in the background could tell us what this device is, how it's used, if it's a container, what goes inside it, anything like that. Maybe if this is a container that's general purpose, but it's designed to be rugged, then maybe show some background that would tell us what environment it's used in, or who might use it, or how they might use it. I also want to know what this button is. Obviously, there's a button of some sort there. That would be nice to know. So some things you could add to explain the context or what this is or how it functions is really where my mind goes. I think from an actual materials and lighting perspective, you did pretty good. I mean, we definitely have good lighting on this. It doesn't look flat. You could have maybe added some stronger lighting just to get this cylinder to pop more. So we could have added a bit more of a highlight here. I do see something, but maybe not as much as you could. Same with this on the side here. I think the lighting on the top cap as well as this plastic part is pretty good as well. One thing you could have done to add a little more detail though is get into this plastic. And even though it is like a smooth acrylic, you could add a teeny bit of texture just to give it that extra realism. Same goes for the lid. Usually you've got some sort of really small, fine texture detail on the surface there. It also looks like we might have, I don't know if this is part of the design or if this is an artifact, but there's a bit of a split line. You can see this line coming in here. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be there. Same goes for these, there's like little streaks, little gray vertical streaks going on. You might just have some surfacing issues on the model that could be fixed as well. I do like the fact that you've got this kind of diagonal, dynamic proportion. You've used a pretty short lens. I can see that the proportion on the cylinder is pretty exaggerated, so that adds some dynamic aspects to it. But like I said, I think where this is really missing out is just some of the context, as well as the last thing I'll mention is how small the object is in the frame. I think it just could be bigger. If this is the product we're supposed to be looking at, why don't we actually zoom in and have it taking up like 80% of the size of the frame? That's where my mind goes. Now, as far as the little splotches we have going on here, I'll address this real quick. You see these little bright kind of white, almost looks like fuzz or noise or clouds. Basically, you've got caustics enabled in the scene. I'm pretty certain you do, and they haven't fully resolved. You don't need caustics for something like this. You just need enough ray bounces for the light to penetrate through. So I would disable caustics in the future because you could remove a lot of this noise without having to let it render so long. So there's our first image. Overall, I think you nailed a few things. You got a focal point, a nice dynamic camera angle, and you've done pretty good job on the materials, but I think really I'm missing the context as well as some of those little details, maybe even using your background to explain how this is used or who it's used by. All right, let's move on to image submission number 2. All right, here we have submission number 2. Let's start out with what I like. I like the fact that I can take a guess as what this is. We've got lots of context. So we have some sort of monitor in the background. We've got a smartphone. So this is obviously somebody's desk. So how can we improve upon this image? We've got a very busy background that almost has this kind of, I don't know, herringbone or something similar looking pattern. And patterns can be very distracting. They're very attention grabbing. Our eyes like patterns, but this is such a strong geometric pattern, it kind of distracts from what we have up front here. And then what makes it even more confusing is that it's being reflected off this back surface of this desk and the phone, I believe. I would much prefer to see the background something much more neutral and something less distracting so it doesn't compete for our attention when we have a lot of detail. Point being, I think that we just need to minimize the distraction of that background there. Now, of course, our focal point is indeed this device, which I think you did a great job with. I also think your lighting is quite nice. It's not super strong and dramatic, but it's nice. We've got a nice directional shadow here. Now let's focus a little bit on what I would do maybe to improve this. I think I would still try to make the device bigger in the frame. I think I would just bring the camera in a little bit closer so we see a little bit more of this object. I don't think we need to see as much of this monitor in the background to let us know that this device somehow works with this computer. So I would probably have cropped it somewhere like at this height and brought our brought us in a little bit so we're looking at it almost like just inside those pink lines. So now that we've zoomed in on the product, I will point out that it looks like we've got some metallic paint on the surface. Now, I'm not sure if this was a decision that you made in the material and you wanted these individual flakes to be visible, but to me, they look a little bit distracting. If I zoom out, it looks kind of, well, pretty gray. It doesn't quite have that metallic look, but if we zoom in, it looks almost like there's noise from the rendering and that those little flecks should not actually be visible. So my thought there is if you've used some sort of metallic paint, those little speckles or flakes could be a lot smaller. Depending on our lighting, we could probably get them to be a little bit brighter and more prominent, giving this more of that metallic appearance. The other thing we have going on, it looks like you've got some sort of a light inside this fan area or this top area, which I think is really cool. I think by tilting our camera view up a little bit, so we're looking down at a bit more of an angle. So if maybe this bottom, if this edge went to like here and then the bottom edge went to like there and then up and then back. So we were looking more down into this device. We could see a little bit more of that. I think that is a really nice detail that I would have loved to see. And I think that's really going to be most of my critique. I think this is a very nice image. To summarize, I think the background is way too distracting. I think we could frame this up in a way where we're focused more on the product and we don't need quite as much of the background. And I would have loved to see a little bit more of a downward angle on top of this device to get some of the details there. And I think from a material standpoint, this gray metallic surface could get some love by making those metallic flakes smaller and maybe increasing the brightness of our lights to get that to reflect a little bit more of that metallic finish, if that's what you were going for. So all in all, nice job. Let's see what we have for the next image. All right, so next we have this car interior, which is nice. I'm gonna be the first one to admit I'm not a big car guy, so take my advice with a grain of salt because I'm not great at this and I don't spend a lot of time looking at car images. I think the first place my mind goes is it's a bit of a strange placement for the camera, but I guess that's why we have render engines, right? We're not constrained by where we can put a camera in real life. I still think I would have maybe had the camera in a bit more of a higher direction, so we were kind of looking down, almost like as if we were looking in through the window instead of down where your knee would be as the driver. I think the biggest thing that I struggle with here is a focal point. We do, let's see, it's hard to say if there's depth of field on in here. There may be a little bit, but not a lot. And perhaps we could benefit from some. I might have been tempted to have a focal point somewhere in here because the camera itself, if you look at kind of the middle of our frame, what we're pointing at is just negative space. So, you know, where my mind goes as ways to improve on this is probably a little bit on the material side, but also on the focal point side and maybe a little bit of the lighting. So I also know that it's hard to light an interior like this. I imagine you have a lot of occluded areas where you want to get lots of bounce light. So good job on you for making sure you got this interior bright enough. When I look at some of these materials here, this, instead of looking like a leathery material that I would expect on this fancy of a car, it looks pretty plastic-like. It looks kind of synthetic. Same goes for this material here. If we zoom in, we have a cool texture, which I like a lot, but what I'm missing, I think, and a lot of the materials in here is any roughness. Now, there is some roughness, but it looks to be quite uniform, meaning that there's not a lot of variation in the texture's shininess. So that's what gives it that kind of patent or plastic appearance, instead of having the more raised surfaces being glossier and then the more recessed areas being a little more rough. So I think they could give some more depth to these materials by not making them all look either so shiny or not making them look uniformly shiny. And that same critique carries over to all these little rivets, or I think these are ports for like cooled seats or something. You've got lots of gold in here, it's a cool aesthetic, but I think, again, they're just too perfectly polished for what I would expect. I think that's going to be most of my critique there. So I just think we need some more non-uniform roughness in here. I think your contrast overall is quite good. I think the subject matter's tricky, so you did a good job there. So when looking at the windshield up here, I think we get this reflection of a light either from the outside or somewhere in the back, and it's just a little bit confusing to my eye. I would have opted to deal with this in a way where you had less of a strong reflection here, either by editing the material of the glass here, or maybe compositing a couple of images so we can just kind of get rid of this distracting reflection. But overall, I think you've done a good job with a tricky subject matter, and I'd really focus on dialing those materials a little bit and seeing what you can do with this kind of distracting reflection here. And then lastly, if you can, maybe make sure you have a focal point. So maybe your camera is tilted or pointed in slightly of a different direction with some heavier depth of field. So wherever your camera's focal point or area is, the rest of the image can be a little de-emphasized so we can focus in on a particular detail. But that's it for this one. Nice job on your car interior. Hopefully that was helpful. So here we are with image number 4. We've got this coffee station. We've got a couple of coffee cups. We've got an empty glass. We've got a couple of French press brewers and a big coffee pot, I believe. So instantly off the bat, what I like about this is that it's a contextual rendering or an in situ rendering where we have a product inside the place it would be used, so we understand what it is and where it belongs. What are some ways I think we can improve on this? I'll start off with what's really simple, just compositionally. If we look, the top of the frame is right there. You see how close the top of your coffee pot gets to the frame. Same thing for the bottom of the glass here. So when you have an object that touches either another object, like the outline, or the edge of the frame, we call those tangents. And in this case, you're just lacking some white space around the object, so it's not breathing as well. It's uncomfortable to the eye when you have an object that comes so close to the frame. So I would naturally just give that a little bit more room to breathe by having cropped in a little higher up. Same thing for the bottom. I don't think this is helping you have the edge of your object intersecting with the edge of the frame. Now, the way your coffee mug is cut off, I think is absolutely fine. But once again, the edge of this French press gets a little too close to the edge of the frame there, from my opinion at least. I think if you're gonna crop in, it's okay to cut off an object, but don't let the object get really close to the frame where you kind of can't decide if you wanna crop or not crop. Yeah, so I think that's the big thing, is just compositionally, we could improve upon that. The next thing that my eye focuses on, even though you've got a very nice looking material on your coffee pot, is this right here. Not sure if you can tell, but bright objects tend to pull our eye immediately. And because you've got these white cabinets in the background with a really strong light on them, we're experiencing what we call blowout, where the color here, instead of having a nice smooth gradient of white, it basically goes to pure white and it's just overexposed and it looks more like a CG rendering. So we try to avoid areas like this, which regardless of what render engine you're using, you can use some tone mapping to kind of clamp those bright values so they don't get so hot in your rendering. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend. While it's not bad, I think we can improve just the layout of what's in here. I would have loved to see, instead of this being nearly centered, I would love it if you had chose kind of a third and kind of align the middle of this pot over there. So if we were to crop in basically something almost like that, maybe. So you're kind of, you know. And then we've lost one of the French presses, but I don't know that we needed two there to begin with. It feels very crowded. A lot of these objects are crammed in. They're all touching each other. I might suggest that we get rid of one of these, or if we're gonna have both of them, maybe move it toward the background so it's somewhere back here instead of up front. Same with your coffee mug. Maybe have one back there, one up here. And I'll be honest, I don't know what this is and why it's here. To me, the product that's most prominently featured is this DeLonghi, I don't know if it's a coffee pot or a carafe, but this thing. So I don't think this glass belongs here or needs to be here. But if you wanted it, I don't know, with lumps of sugar or something for the coffee, then that would make sense. I would make sure that you have added those in if possible. So I think compositionally, we just want a little bit more breathing room. We've got this big empty table in the background. Why not use some depth in our frame, have some objects closer to the front, some further to the back? I think that would do wonders for improving the composition here. And I didn't comment really on any materials because I think, again, this is a beautiful material. You've got really nice reflections and lighting in here. I like how the background here kind of darkens. One thing maybe this thing with all these pink things in it is a little bit distracting. It's kind of has the same thing like this does, where it's drawing my eye because the rest of this image is very neutrally colored, but these are bright pink compared to everything else in here. So they're a little distracting. I'd consider maybe somehow de-emphasizing this, whether the color of those change or if it becomes smaller. Maybe it's off frame more, so it just takes up less space. I don't know. But or maybe you can use some generic porcelain containers here that you'd find in a kitchen instead of whatever this is. Anyway, that's my feedback on this particular image. I think there's a lot happening in this that I like. And I think with some very small tweaks, it could be a lot better. Just making use of some of the depth in the frame, giving these objects some space to breathe, not cropping in so close to some of these elements, and addressing some of the distracting parts of the background. I think that's all you'd have to do, and it would be a very nice image that would be even better. So hopefully you find that helpful. Let's take a look at our next image. Here we are with image number 5, and this one's pretty. I gotta say, this is a very professional looking shot. Very happy with how this looks. So first off, as I mentioned, I find this to be a very professional shot. This looks like it could go in a magazine ad or a website, which is, you know, for most of us, that's what we're trying to achieve with our images. We want them to be professional to where someone maybe would pay for us to do something like this. Reasons I say it looks professional is because, first of all, we have a nice balanced and highly exposed shot, meaning we do have some dark, but we also have lots of brights that don't look muddy. It's not too gray. It's like we have some nice brights and we have some pure white specular reflections in here, which I think do read correctly. They do look pretty good. Maybe those could be dialed back just a tiny bit so we don't look like we're overexposed here. Especially if you're dealing with a polished, highly polished metal, you are gonna want some of those bright specular reflections. So I think that looks very good. And it's a clean looking image, meaning I don't see any noise anywhere. I don't see any patterns where caustics haven't been resolved or anything like that. So there's a lot to like about this. I'll also mention that this person did a good job of using either lens correction or a shift lens in the render engine where their vertical edges are all parallel. And this really helps things look neat and tidy. It prevents our vertical lines from converging near the edge of the frame, which can be very distracting and a hallmark of somebody who's maybe more of a beginner. So kudos to you, whoever did this. This is a fantastic shot. I also really like the bluish hue up top and then the warmer hue down here. It's subtle, and I don't know if it was intentional, but it just looks really nice. So I think this does a good job, especially from the narrative standpoint too. I don't know if I've got an overactive imagination, but it gives us this kind of steamy hint of like somebody in their shower where it's like all kind of steamy and stuff. So this has a bit of a seductive nature to it, especially given the curves of this bottle. All right, so it's no surprise that I really like this image. I think you did a good job on it, but how would I go about trying to improve it? The first thing that comes to mind is cropping just a little bit. I think we don't need quite as much negative space toward the bottom of this frame. And I think even up top, I'd say the same. I'd come in further on the left, maybe, to give this more of a true rule of thirds sort of cropping. And I think, something about that, something like this looks a little bit better to me, brings us in a little bit closer to your subject. And I think I'd play with the lighting in the scene even further to experiment to see if I could get some more dynamic range or some more contrast in the scene. So could you use some, I don't know, adjust the lighting or use some cards to try to block some of the light on the lower part of this scene So maybe we get more dark shadows somewhere down in here. You can usually do this by darkening the environment that you're shooting in instead of having it all well lit. And I also don't know if you rendered with caustics on or not. I suspect maybe not, but sometimes with shapes that are very curvy like this, you end up with more cool caustic light patterns when you have them enabled. I think the last thing I'm gonna point out is I was under the impression this was like a gold, like a metal, but it looks to me, given the glass at the bottom, this is a clear glass perfume bottle with some sort of a yellowish liquid inside it. So that threw me for a loop. I'm not sure. Oh, I think it's because your index of refraction on this glass is so high, it looks almost like a polished metal. Not saying that's bad, but I think I was a little confused by that. So maybe double check your values for that. But that right there is going to be my summary of how I would go about trying to improve this. Already very nice looking shot. Good job on you. So here we are looking at image number 6, and I have to say I like it. This is a nice shot as well. I think things that are working here are the high contrast nature of the shot. We've got a dark background with some highly specular materials or objects which just jump right off the page, which I think is great. I also like the hierarchy. We have a good read of primary, secondary, and tertiary objects. And the reason I'd say that is because they're getting smaller as they're moved further from the camera, essentially. I think the placement of these chains are really good. I'm not sure how you did this, if they were simulated in a software or not, but really well done. They bring a lot of believability to this scene, which I think is great. So what could we do to improve upon this? For me, it's gonna have a lot to do with framing. I think we've got tons of negative space back here that's not doing us any favors. I don't mind the negative space up front so much, but the stuff in the back I do a little bit, because the amount of negative space we have here might make these objects feel less significant than they are, so we can make them look a little more important. I'd make better use of the frame. I guess what I'm saying is I think the square cropping here is not doing you any favors. I mean, you could have cropped in like this for almost like a 16:9 cropping, and that would have worked really well, I think, because you've got the chains going off in each direction, which also help fill some of that negative space. I just don't think we need so much of a background there. Also, we're definitely clipping here with your highlights. I don't know quite what's going on there, but you want to make sure that if at all possible, we have kind of a smooth gradient from dark to light, not this abrupt, blown out, overexposed white area. And it looks like that may be happening on some of the jewelry a bit too. Using some tone mapping can help out with that quite a bit. I have to say I really like the shape of these. These are super cool objects. I think they can be bigger in the frame actually. So if we zoom out, we can tell there's something there, but we can't quite get a good read on the form of them. I wonder, almost like, you know, if you were cropped in way closer, almost like this to me is a much stronger composition and cropping, especially because now that we view it larger, we really get a sense for what's going on. And we're not missing anything that we saw that we cropped out. Like it's not helping the image at all. So this is a really, yeah, I'd crop in something like that. I think your lighting is quite good. I like how you have basically directional gradient of lighting from light to dark, which really does a good job here. I don't have a lot of nitpicks on this one. I would just say maybe some tone mapping to watch. You're really blown out on these highlights in some key areas that can make this look a little less realistic. Like I get that it's metal and highly specular, but using, you know, Filmic and Blender or image styles and KeyShot or whatever other software you're using, you can do some image tone mapping to try to get away from those blowing out quite as much, which will help you a lot. And then I think lastly, maybe compositionally, I would take advantage of more depth in this frame. So I like where this first one is. I think the second one's even good. I think this third one needs to move back just a little bit so it has some more separation between the others. But other than that, awesome image, cool design as well, and I hope that was helpful. All right, here we are looking at image number 7, and it looks like we have something that plugs into a vehicle so you can charge your devices. I'm gonna go ahead and draw a little outline of the frame because it's a little hard to see the way I have my background set up. So one thing that comes to mind here is this is kind of like an e-commerce shot, right? It's just a product, solid color background, not much else going on. There is a time and place for this type of object. So I'm not going to always suggest that it has to be put in context, because this might be a rendering that you put on a website, Amazon or something like that to sell the product. So that's fine. I think the composition's good. It also looks like you've used, if not orthographic, a nearly orthographic angle. Notice we don't have any sort of tapering of this device as it moves further from the camera. We call that perspective. In this case, they've used an orthographic lens probably. I think it can, I don't love using orthographic because it looks too perfect. The object, it looks a little less realistic. If it's a stylistic choice, fine, but I would tend to use more like a 120 to 200 millimeter lens instead of full orthographic. That can help make it look a little more like it was shot with a camera. I think you've managed the highlight on here really well, meaning you have a bright highlight, core reflection, or whatever you want to call that, but it's not blowing out anywhere. It looks like you've done a good job managing the exposure of this, whether you've done that through tone mapping or maybe you adjusted the levels in Photoshop, whatever you did, looks really nice. And I like the green ring around here too, looks pretty good. One thing that I'd question is the angle. I understand that this is showing us kind of the overall shape, but could we have maybe turned this around a little bit so we're seeing more of the face? Because right now I think where my attention is drawn is this stuff here, all the manufacturing and technical data that doesn't need to be shared. When you plug this into a car, everything to the right of that pink line is hidden from view. So I don't think you need to show as much of that. I would have rotated this around so we're looking more like the face here and it's going further away from us. So pardon my terrible drawing. Because here, the pilot, whether that's the name of it, it says co-charger or, yeah, co-charger, I think, like co-pilot charger, maybe something. I just think this is a little hard to read and I want to know what it is. And for the consumer, we probably want to know that that's a USB port and then we've got like USB, whatever it is, C, because this is the feature, right? None of the rest of this is the feature. I would emphasize the face of this more so than you have. And so the last thing I want to mention is that with these e-commerce shots, they're typically on a white background. And I just noticed that the rendering itself is indeed a PNG. So we've got transparent pixels here. So if we were to put a solid color white background behind this, let's go ahead and just do this real quick. So here's what the product looks like on a white background. And when it's on a website or in a catalog or printed, this is typically how it's going to look. So all in all, this is a pretty standard e-commerce shot. You've done a good job getting nice, clean materials, your reflections well managed. I think there's not a lot to complain about. The only recommendations I'd have is rotating the angle a little bit more toward us so we can see the face, which has all the features that you want to call out. And maybe you would introduce then some sort of lighting on the face so it's not competing for attention with the metallic nature of the rest of this object. And I would probably shift away from an orthographic camera, something with a little perspective, maybe 120 millimeters or even 200, something like that. That's what I would do if this were my rendering to improve upon. Other than that, you did a great job. So image number 8 is a toothbrush, and it's a nice, bright, backlit rendering that I think looks really good. The person who made this probably understands that toothbrushes are pretty tricky to render, only because they're skinny, small objects. And so their choice to crop toward the bottom of the frame, I think, was a good one, because if they were to, make sure that the toothbrush was small enough in this frame that we saw the whole thing, then we would really be missing a lot of the details. So if I zoom in here, you can see the back side of this toothbrush has a cool sort of a tactile pattern there. They've also gone to the trouble to get all the bristles in there, as well as these kind of gum massaging pieces. So lots of good detail there. And I'm now noticing there's these dark speckles inside the plastic, giving it a nice composite feel. So there's a lot of detail going on in this image that when you're zoomed out can be hard to see. And if this person were to have made the toothbrush small enough to fit in the whole frame, we'd be missing a lot of those details. So good call on the framing, I think. I think my biggest next question is going to be all about what this thing is. And we're going to come back to that in a second. One more thing before I move on to ways to improve. I think that their lighting is nice. They chose to backlight this, meaning the light is somewhere behind the object. What that does in this rendering is it gives us some nice lighting kind of moving across this textured surface as well as hitting the back edges. So it gives us this kind of halo effect where we get to see light spilling around the object, which looks really, really good. what would I do to improve upon this one? And this is hard because it's so simple. Usually with really simple renderings, there's not a lot of ways you can go in there and improve upon them without changing everything about the image. So this thing here, I don't know what it is, but it obviously has something to do with the design of this toothbrush. I'm not even gonna try to guess. I just don't know what it is. And I think if our camera was pointing more toward this part here, maybe I would understand what this thing is. I don't know if there's key text in here that explains what it is or how it works. I don't know. That's a bit of a long shot there. Maybe they could have also done a rendering where we have two of these toothbrushes in the same shot, maybe one further back and one closer to the frame like we have it here. And that would have given us some depth and hierarchy so we could look at one of them, but then use the context of the second shot or angle to understand more of what's happening in this one single shot. Now that said, this may be an e-commerce style shot where, kind of like the last one we looked at, where this is gonna go on a website. There may be extra images. In fact, there likely would be images of just this component here or some detail shots here so we could understand what this is. Also, as I zoom in, it looks like the parts nearest to the camera of this device are fuzzy and the parts furthest toward the back. So this person used an extremely shallow depth of field, so only a sliver of the middle of this toothbrush is in focus. I think that's a nice, like they did a good job doing that to keep the focus on the toothbrush. But at the same time, because this is such a small object and we're already blurring, like the depth of field is so shallow that we're blurring this device, I don't know that it's really exactly necessary, but I think, you know, it doesn't kill the image either. So yeah, I think this is a hard one. This is a really hard one for me to critique because I don't know that I would have done a lot different than what this person did here. I might consider bringing in two images of this toothbrush in one frame to see if I could explain a little better what it is. But I think they did a great job on the lighting. It's very balanced. It's professional looking with the nice white background. We've got a lot of detail in there. Maybe the bristles could be lit just a little better. This looks a little dark, but all in all, it's a nice looking image. And I'm not sure I would change really much of anything there. So good job on this rendering. I hope me talking through some of those thoughts are at least helpful. All right, here we are looking at image number 9, and it looks like we have a knife. The knife is the focus of this product rendering. I think it reads really well. The things that jump out to me that are strong about this image is it's got a lot of context. There is no question of what this is, how it's used, where it's used, all that. So I think that's cool. I also love the vibrancy. There's lots of good contrast in this image. We've got nice dark shadows here. We also have these bright, vibrant greens, which look really nice. It helps this image have some contrast. I think this person did a good job lighting this image because we get some nice strong shadows, we get some core highlights. So I think those are my favorite aspects of this rendering. But let's go ahead and take a look at what we might do to improve an image like this. So the first thing that comes to mind is this pattern on the blade of the knife. It's a cool pattern, but typically the way knives are made, they're not gonna have any sort of pattern on the entire metallic part. Usually this part, and sorry, I don't actually know the anatomy of a blade, but this part usually is not the same piece as this part. They can be, I suppose, but typically, again, even if they're one part, this would not usually have some sort of design printed on it. Also, I'm not sure if this is supposed to look like it's like a Damascus steel, like it's actually part of the steel. If so, there's a very distinct pattern to Damascus that if you wanted to do, I think this is missing that mark. This looks like it's more like a stylized, it almost looks like, yeah, I don't really know. And then lastly, with a blade like this, that edge, you're gonna have a little bit of an edge that should be completely shiny. I mean, it would have some roughness to it, but you should have an edge where there's nothing printed on it, basically, where the knife has been sharpened, essentially. So I think there's some details that need some attention in the actual blade itself. And the wood handle almost looks like a burl wood, where it's got a lot of these like swirly patterns, which that's cool. But again, I think for whatever reason, the texture itself is losing a bit of its, there's some properties of this that look odd, almost like you've got a yellow specular value. So like the light reflecting off of it's colored and it's just a little bit odd looking. Okay, so that's nitpicking the knife a little bit. If we look at the whole image, I don't think the knife is prominently enough the focal point of the image. This vegetable, I think, is the focal point. It is bright green against a black background, which is a really strong color combo. It's almost bigger than the knife. For those two reasons, I kind of become distracted. Oh, and it's like in the middle of the frame. So that makes my eye go straight to this. I would, if at all possible, reframe this so we have less focus on the rest of these. So what if you were framed or cropped in almost like this? And maybe your knife, instead of going quite as vertically, maybe if your knife was more like here in the frame, then you could still have some of these other elements, but they'd be less distracting and they wouldn't be fighting for attention for the knife here. I think that also, you have a really strong branded item here, this Jack Daniel's, like everyone kind of knows this iconic bottle. And again, even it has the ability to compete for attention with this knife. Even this whiskey bottle could be kind of cut off, so we kind of know what it is, but we don't see their big logo on it. That might be helpful. But like I said earlier, I think you did a good job with lighting this. I assume this is a photo backplate with the knife integrated in it. If not, if this whole thing is CG, then very, very well done. Good job. But what I was gonna say about the lighting is I like how you have this dark shadow from the bottle and then the bright reflection off the blade. And then we go to a dark contact shadow and then reflection off the ground. So I just think you've done a good job of paying attention to where your reflections and where your shadows go. I think that's really nice. The knife itself needs a little bit of love on some of those textures, making sure that you look at a reference of a knife really closely and see if you can capture some of those very fine details. Then reframe your image so the knife plays more prominently in the shot. I think you can go with more of a horizontal layout of the knife, and it feels like it's less important. I know we talk about a lot about the rule of thirds. I'm going on and on about that. Even though this knife kind of falls in the bottom lower third, I think it actually looks less important or less prominent because of how high contrast these other objects are. And the textures on these other all these other objects look so much more convincing than the ones on the knife. So I think that's where your knife needs a little bit of love as well. Good job on this though. Again, I know that sounds harsh. I gave it a lot of criticism, but I hope that is useful in seeing how you could take this image, make some slight adjustments, and come out on the other side a lot stronger. That's at least what I hope. Okay, here we are looking at image number 10. And this is a cool image of a drum. The textures on this are beautiful, by the way. I don't know if any of them were made by the person who did this rendering or not, but they're lovely textures. This fabric backdrop looks amazing. Your lighting is super good. The drum itself is a great model. I mean, there's a lot to like about this. This might be a pretty hard one to critique here. I think you've nailed the contrast in this image. So if I zoom out, you've got this nice, simple composition. Like you can make this almost like a teeny tiny image, and yet it still reads fine. So I think you've done a great job simplifying the shot. I think your composition's good. In this case, a symmetrical composition works really well for this, especially because it's a symmetrical product. It looks very nice there. And I like that you've put this kind of hard surface organic object on top of a soft fabric podium or pedestal. So nice job there. And your highlights versus your darks look pretty nice. You've got good shadows, good strong directional light. You have a primary light source running through the left side, and then you have a good fill light on the right. So I think overall this looks really, really nice. And the fabric gets bright without blowing out. It looks like we do have some really hot spots on this brass type material, but it's not going to pure white. There's still color in there. So I honestly think that looks fine. Maybe a little hot here on the drum, like, I don't know what that's called, the skin, where that material is like stretched over there. Maybe a little bit bright, but other than that, I mean, nicely done. And I don't know, it looks like you have a warm light source and maybe a cooler light source here. Maybe my eyes are playing tricks on me, I'm not sure. But if you did that, that's also working in your favor. So how would I go about improving upon this? Short answer is gonna be, I'm not really sure. This is a super strong rendering in my opinion, because your textures look good, the lighting looks good, the framing and composition look good. Yeah, I don't really, I even think this fabric backdrop is very suiting for the object. Like I can't think of really any other way I would present this that would be significantly better. And I love the fact that these textures are so nice and detailed too. And your rope looks really good. Even that's textured properly. So fantastic job with this one. I would maybe maybe experiment with some different lighting. So on this side, you've got the product is kind of dark here, and then the backdrop is lighter than the product. Maybe there's a way you could light this in such a way where the fabric backdrop gets less light than your drum does, and then this drum would stand out against the fabric. So maybe we can make the fabric recede by darkening it while having the drum brighter out front. And I'm not entirely sure, like I think you could do that in the render engine by playing with your lighting a little bit, and that would just help give the drum some more presence, meaning it would come closer to the frame. Usually dark values go toward the back of the frame, whereas light values come toward the front of the frame. But you still get a bit of a silhouette by having the fabric backdrop brighter than the drum. So at least the shape of your drum is still maintained and you have some good highlights on it. So maybe my suggestion of changing the lighting so the backdrop is darker is not, maybe it wouldn't look any better. Maybe you've done a great job just the way it is. So I'm gonna go ahead and tap out on this one. I think you've done a fantastic job. I enjoyed pointing out everything I liked about this one. I don't think there's really anything I can come up with that you should do to make this better. This is a fantastic rendering. So what a way to finish out image number 10. Good job. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. And there you have it, another 10 images critiqued by me. I hope you enjoy watching these and that they're somewhat educational for you. And I will say they're actually quite a challenge for me to do. I had a friend prepare all these Photoshop documents for me, so when I opened up each image, it's the first time I'm actually seeing it. This forces me to think on my feet and come up with feedback off the top of my head, which is quite challenging, but it's also a lot of fun to do. So with that, like I said, I hope you learned something, hope you enjoyed this, and until next time, happy rendering.